Good evening. On behalf of KPCC and Southern California Public Radio, welcome to the Crawford Family Forum for tonight's program, Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. And now, your host for this evening, KPCC's science reporter, Sandon Totten.
Hey everybody. I'm excited you all came out on this horrible cold November night here in Southern California. I'm glad you all made it, with the snow tires on and everything. Just kidding, it's beautiful here. All you people streaming in from other parts of the country, suck it. Okay, so yeah, I'm excited today because we have a really exciting topic. It is a heavy one though. This is, moral cognition. We're talking about neuroscience. So everyone get your thinking caps on. We'll try to make it fun, but your brains are going to be active. And a lot of people think of morality. You may picture like a little angel and devil on your shoulders, but we're actually going to try to be a little more rational than that today. So kind of brush off the angel and devil, and let's maybe summon a little, maybe Sherlock Holmes and Sheldon Cooper kind of, scientists and detectives here, because we're going to try to really think rationally about moral decisions and what goes into them. But before we jump into that, this book is called Moral Tribes, and I want to tell a quick story about kind of one of the first times I realized that I was in a tribe myself. And it was growing up. When I was in high school, I spent a year abroad in Japan. It was partly I was motivated by a curiosity of other cultures and partly by an undying love of sushi. And so I spent this year in Japan, and it was really lovely. I learned a new language. I met all sorts of great people. I saw some amazing cultural festivals. I fell in love with my first anime program, Neon Genesis Evangelion, if there's any other nerds here. But one part of this was very difficult for me with this experience that I didn't expect. You see, I had just finished 11th grade, and I had read all these kind of books that were sort of dystopian, Brave New World, 1984, these ones that really recommended, bucking society's orders. You just didn't want to follow the rules of the government or the man. You wanted to be your own, sheep, and not follow the herd. I was also obsessed with all these writers, like rugged individuals like Hemingway, Kerouac. Anyone else go through a phase like that, Right. These are people who blazed their own path. They didn't care what other people thought. I also listened to an obnoxious amount of punk rock, which 3-minute songs about sticking it to the man, marching to the beat of your own drum. So basically, I was just inundated with all these messages about doing it yourself to the chagrin of everybody else. But here's where I kind of realized this was a problem, was when I was in Japan, and a lot of my friends and family didn't see those things the same way I did. They didn't get what I was so obsessed with about this, sort of rugged individualistic idea. They thought that being part of the team was a good thing. Following the herd was good. They thought you'd want to be a team player. You'd want to help everybody else out. Why go and blaze your own path when we have a really great road here and everybody's working on it together? And I was kind of confused by this. My punk rock ethos of pushing it against society's norms didn't seem to fit. They saw that almost as sort of callously disregarding tradition and respect for your elders. And suddenly I kind of felt like an outsider, even though in America it was so cool to be that way. So I struggled with this. How do you fit into this giant societal machine, especially because The Matrix had just come out, and I was like, I don't want to be part of that, But it didn't seem so bad when I was in Japan because people, they saw it as a good thing, and I sort of realized that built in my DNA was this assumption that it's good to be an individual, and built in theirs was that it's good in some ways to be part of a group, a collectivist thing. And that's when it dawned on me that, who's to say which world is right to live in, and what worldview works best. I didn't know. Both societies, America and Japan, are very successful. And I figured there's a lot to be learned, but it really taught me that I was part of a tribe and I didn't even realize it, this sort of individualist tribe that makes up a lot of American culture. So with that, I'd like to introduce Joshua Greene. He is from Harvard. Everyone give him a big round of applause here. So he just wrote a book. It's called Moral Tribes. It actually looks at some of these things, how we form tribes, how our tribes form their values. He's also a professor at Harvard, and he runs the Moral Cognition Lab, which is one of the coolest sounding labs I've ever heard. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. So first of all, you've been traveling around a lot talking about your book. How many places have you been in the last month?
Oh, well, it's really only been the last couple of weeks. Mostly it was stuff around Boston, and then I was in New York and D.C. and doing a West Coast trip this week, off to Seattle tomorrow. It was just up in the Bay Area, but it's been great. It's been fun and hearing people. I'm looking forward to your questions and getting your thoughts as well. I've been learning a lot. So
Yeah, so we're going to do questions a little towards the end after we kind of get through discussion. So if you didn't read the entire book like I did, we'll hopefully
there'll
give
be
you
a quiz
primer.
later.
But I do want to ask you, so you're from Boston. That's at least where you work.
It's for
Talking about tribes,
Right.
how's your Boston tribe? They must be pretty happy right now after the
Oh
Red
no!
Sox.
Yeah, the Boston tribe is wicked pissed at. We're pretty happy there. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Almost as happy as when the Yankees lose. Yeah.
Well, that's a joy everyone can share.
That's right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we're going to talk a little bit about tribes here. Let's see if we got this working. There's all kinds of tribes. You could think of religions as a form of tribe. Of course, we talked about sports teams. Tea Party is definitely a tribe that's been on the rise lately in America. And then my favorite, the Twilight tribe. All sorts of different things unite us, from social values to our love of Robert Pattinson. But I want to talk a little bit about this because in your book you talk about how we in some ways seem to be hardwired to form these tribes, that it's not just something we do because of Facebook groups, but there might actually be an evolutionary basis for that. Where did we get this idea from, and how do we know this?
Well, so the first thing is to think about if there's a biological basis to morality at all, in some sense it's going to have to be tribal. So what is morality about? And the core of morality is having some concern for other people, not just being completely selfish, right? And it was a major question from from an evolutionary perspective. Why would natural selection favor people who are nice? The idea is that evolution is red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson said, that those who conquer and grab all the resources for themselves, they're the ones who are going to survive. So where does niceness come in?
Yeah, survival of the fittest even sounds like
exactly
the fittest person's there and everyone else is on the floor.
And Darwin was troubled by this, but he actually speculated and got the right answer, which is that that niceness, that morality can be a competitive weapon. That is, it's teamwork, essentially. And so if you have a capacity to be good to other people, you can get into relationships with other people who can reciprocate back. You can form a team, and the teams that work together are more likely to survive and reproduce. So, but the catch is that natural selection isn't going to favor that unless it provides some kind of competitive advantage. So just as with why are lions fast and strong? Well, the lions that weren't as fast and weren't as strong, they didn't leave as many offspring, and here we are. In the same way, groups that were less cooperative didn't survive as well, and so and that's why we are a cooperative species insofar as our niceness evolved. But the catch again is that if that's true, then we didn't evolve to be nice to everybody.
Well, we'll get to that in a second, but I want to so I want to hammer into this idea a little bit here. You said that there's this theory that why would we have evolved morality, evolved a way to be nice to each other,
right?
And it's a great theory, it's a great idea, but there's actually you've done research and looked at research that says so it's not just a theory. There seems to be sort of almost neurological proof that we form this. Tell me about some of the research that backs up this idea.
So I'll say first some very interesting research with young children. So children who are very young, babies essentially. Experiment done by Catherine Kinsler and colleagues. You have two people come into the lab. There's a baby there, and one of them speaks with a native English accent, and the other speaks with a French accent, let's say, is how they did in the experiment. They did the same version.
The babies talk?
Sorry, no, the baby is listening to two people.
Oh, okay.
So there's an adult who speaks native English and an adult who's speaking English with a French accent, and they did the same experiment in France. And what they find is that the children, later when they're offered a toy by both adults at the same time, they prefer to take the toy from the person with the native accent. And these are children who even don't speak or don't speak very well. That very young children are tuned into language as a marker of who's us and who's them.
Wow.
Another example of this, and this is getting more into the neuroscience, there's a neuropeptide hormone called oxytocin, which plays a lot of different roles in mammalian physiology. There's a big burst of oxytocin when mothers give birth. It's also related to breastfeeding. It's also related to orgasms. And it seems to play a role in social affiliation and trust. So if we were playing an economic sort of game, as they call it, like this, where let's say I have a certain amount of money, let's say $10, and I can give it to you, and once you get it, it doubles, let's say, and it turns into $20.
So when you have $10, you give it to me, it turns into 20.
Right, and then the question is, so here's the catch. are you going to share it with me? So that is, are you going to keep the 20, or are you going to, or actually, let's say it doubles to 40 or quadruples to 40.
Okay.
Right? So that now the question is, you can keep all 40, or you can say, give me 20 back, right?
Right.
And so this is called the trust game for the obvious reason that I am trusting you to take this resource. It turns into something even better.
Because you could have just kept the
Right.
10 and
Right.
not given me any.
And so, so what these researchers found is that when you spray oxytocin into the nose, the reason why they do it in the nose is that it allows it to cross the blood-brain barrier. So it's a similar principle as if you're snorting cocaine, essentially.
You're just snorting oxytocin.
You're snorting oxytocin.
Okay. We've all done
it
that
doesn't
at
feel
parties, right,
quite
guys?
as good, from what I'm told. And what the effect that it has is it will make me more trusting. It will make me more willing to give you money, expecting that you're going to give some in return. So oxytocin, trust, but some more recent experiments, including ones using trolley problems, which we'll talk about in a little bit, show that the oxytocin works for someone who is you see as a member of your in-group. But if it's someone who's an out-group, so this was done in the Netherlands, and they had a name that suggested that this was a Muslim person, which is sort of the main kind of politically contentious out-group in the Netherlands at this point. Then you didn't see this effect, and there was even some indication that oxytocin made people more negative towards members of out-group.
Huh, so it sort of almost just heightened your team, us versus them sensibilities.
Right. So it's a single, I mean, what's kind of amazing about this is that it's a single chemical pathway in the brain that has the simultaneous effect of making us more willing to trust someone who's seen as a member of us, but not any more trusting, and if anything, less trusting, or have a less positive attitude towards someone who we see as a them.
Interesting. And I mean, the one thing that you can take away from this too, there's almost no hardware in the brain that's not there for a reason. And if we've got the hardware in order to interpret this oxytocin, to do something with it, it must be there, like you said, for some evolutionary reason that helped us develop through the ages into the
right. I mean, there's certainly plenty of things that we may
are.
believe that don't do any good, but when you have something as basic as a chemical pathway, a kind of lock and key, that's unlikely to be functioning purely as a cultural add-on. That it's likely to be something that's sort of part of the original biological design.
Interesting. One of the other things you mentioned in your book that I found kind of fascinating was you talked about teams, and when people are put in teams for various studies,
Right.
and that people, even if they're randomly assigned
Right.
to a team, you just walk
Right.
into an office and they say,
Right.
oh, we're doing an experiment, you're with this team over here.
Right.
And then you give them some sort of thing where they have to compete
Right.
against another random
Right.
group. They already prefer their team that they were
Yep.
randomly assigned to
Right.
more than someone else.
Coin
We
flip,
just-
right. So
we
this
can't
is
even help it.
Right. Famous experiments done by Henri Tajfel, who looked at the events of World War II. So these experiments were done, I think, in the 60s or 70s, and said, why are we like this? Why are we so tribal? And so he did these classic experiments where you had people randomly assigned to these transparently meaningless teams, and then said, here's $1, you can give it to members of your group or others which you want to give, or you can even make it so that you can give a little bit more money to the other people. No, I'll give it to my group that I was randomly assigned to 2 minutes ago. It's just very, very basic, right? And you probably have this feeling like if you turn on like some sporting event, right, that you're not used to watching, you feel this urge, I have to figure out which team to root for. I can't just watch it. I just enjoy the athleticism. I have to pick a side, even if it's random, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, just an FYI, you're all on Team KPCC. So if you want to give $1 as a member.
That's right. You got the oxytocin, right? Ready to
we've
spraying
pumping
out
it
of the
in.
ceilings. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. You also mention, a little bit that we have sort of moral mechanisms built into how we relate to team members, that we seem to have sort of instincts that help us not just form teams but cooperate as teams.
Right.
Like one of the ones that there's a picture in the book, and I couldn't find it, otherwise I would put it on the slideshow, but there's a guy sitting there,
Right.
and he's got a leg here with a big X, and
There you
another
go.
guy with a
Yeah.
hammer.
Right.
And he was basically in an experiment where he's told, hit the other guy in the leg with a hammer, which sounds horrible until you find out that they tell the people, right, that the leg is a fake leg. You're not going to hurt this person,
Right.
but just hit it with a hammer, and people
Right.
can't really do it as hard as they could.
Or they're very reluctant, and you see this big. So in this experiment done by Fiery Cushman and colleagues, they had people hooked up to a whole sort of set of physiological recording machines, and what you find is that the technical term is vasoconstriction. It's basically cold feet. That when people were asked to simulate these violent acts, knowing full well that there was actually no harm to be done, you saw this cold feet response in their veins. And you don't get it when you're watching someone else do it, right? And you don't get it when you're doing a physically similar thing, like please hit this piece of wood with a hammer, right? And the idea is that we have evolved these mechanisms that make us reluctant to harm people. Now, of course, we all know humans can be extremely violent and perfectly willing to harm people. So
Right.
it's not quite as black and white as that, and there's probably a lot of learning involved. But nevertheless, we have that capacity to form that kind of, don't feel like doing that cold feet response when it comes to harming others.
Right, it's like we almost have in some ways a sort of a gut reaction that we can't even explain
Right.
against wanting to hurt members of what we see as our own tribe, other people, you
Right.
know?
At least if they're, that's right. At least if we view them as innocent. If you see them as having wronged you or your people in some way, then break out the hammers.
Yeah.
Right.
We'll beat up all their fake legs.
Right.
Do you have any other examples like that, though, of ways in which we've seen research kind of prove that we not only want to be on teams, but that we want to cooperate and not do
Right.
each other wrong? Because, I mean,
Yeah.
one of the biggest tricks of society is not only getting everyone to work together, but to get
Right.
us from not stabbing each other in the back constantly and
Right.
stealing from each other and having rules. I mean, we have laws, obviously, but
Right.
I think we're guided more than just by laws. There seemed to be some sort of our sense of what's right when you're dealing with your group.
Yeah, so a nice example of this, I think, is an experiment done recently with David Rand and Martin Novak, where we had people play what's called the public goods game. So this is another one of these economic games. The public goods game is essentially the tragedy of the commons, if some of you are familiar with that. Say 4 people come into the lab. Everyone is given $10 to start out. And you can keep your $10, or you can put your $10 into this common pool. And as in the other experiment I described, the experimenters, let's say, double the amount that goes into the pool, and then it gets divided equally among everybody. And so if you're selfish, if you're me-ish, then what you do is you keep your $10, and that way you get your $10, plus you'll get your share of whatever other people put in and then subsequently got doubled. If you're us-ish, what you do is you put all your money in because, well, that's what's going to maximize the total doubling, and that's what's going to improve our total take. Now, what we were interested in is, what is the psychology behind the cooperation? What's the psychology behind selfishness? And so to get at this, we did a few different things, but one of the more straightforward things we did was put people under time pressure when making this decision, or have people take extra long. You have to think about this for at least a minute or something like that.
Okay.
And what we found was that when you put people under time pressure, they became more cooperative. They put more money into the common pool. Now, you might think it's the opposite, right? Especially if you have kind of the old view of evolution, which is that your instinct is to be selfish, right?
Right,
and
right.
then you might think, oh no, upon reflection, really, I should be nice. But that wasn't the pattern that we saw. Instead, making people go faster, forcing people to go faster made them more cooperative, and forcing people to slow down made them less cooperative. But interestingly, this was not true of everybody. So this is not hardwired, as people often like to say. If you ask people, do you trust the people that you interact with in your daily life? The people who say no, they don't show this time differential. Their gut reaction is to keep their money, and upon reflection, they keep their money.
Well, obviously they don't trust people, so they're sort of, the person I do trust, I'm going to make sure gets some money.
So if you have this basic sort of trusting response, and this is quite culturally variable, and this is sort of getting at some points you raised earlier, for those people, which were the dominant response in the groups that we looked at, the first instinct is to be cooperative.
So it does seem like in some ways, though, we don't know if it's sort of hardwired or if it's learned, but we do have a lot of instincts built in that make us want to cooperate with each other, to share, not to stab each other in the back, not to hit each other on the leg with hammers.
Right.
And that's all really good because, society obviously thrives when we can make people work together. And, if we couldn't.
Hard to get anything done if everybody's whacking everybody's legs, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but as we've all seen every day in and out of the news, people don't always get along harmoniously. We have lots of clashes. This was actually taken from a Wikipedia article on shouting. That was their
He's
image.
like the world's platonic form of the shouter.
Yeah. I think it might be the fact that his pants are actually seem really tight and high, which would make a lot of people uncomfortable. But it leads us to this bigger question. So we form these tribes, and we're great at making tribes cooperate.
Right.
But we also have lots of tribal clashes. That's all. Like, to some people, that's the story of humanity: is that we form groups and then they fight. And so, what leads to that? Why is it that we don't see humanity as one giant kumbaya melting pot, and we all the same rules that go towards me wanting to not hit people in the leg and share my money don't lead me to want to do that for everybody and make this whole world a better place.
Right. Well, so this gets back to what we talked about earlier with the sort of the biological perspective on all of this. The most straightforward biological expectation is that all individuals are going to be selfish, that we're going to be like sharks, let's say, where there's just no communal life at all, right? There are other social species. In fact, our nearest living relatives, so chimpanzees and bonobos, they live in troops. And chimpanzees, more than bonobos, are especially violent. So if there are two chimpanzee colonies, typically groups of males will patrol the outer rim of the territory. And if they encounter a chimp from another troop, and they outnumber that chimp, they'll just kill that chimpanzee in a pretty ghastly way. And it's not to say that we are not chimps, but we have common ancestors with chimps. So if you were just trying to guess what is this upright, not so hairy ape going to be like, and you looked at chimpanzees as our nearest relatives, you would expect us to be highly nastily tribal. And that's what makes sense from a biological point of view, either because we're going to be, well, nasty, either we'd be nasty selfish as individuals or nasty selfish as groups, which is to say we cooperate with our team, but it's us against them. That's really, as I said, anything that's going to evolve biologically, it has to be because it confers a competitive advantage. Now, you in the audience, this might sound like, that doesn't sound like morality, right? The interesting thing is we are not, our moral thinking is not limited to the aspects of it that we inherited biologically. So the way I put it is that everything about us that really is in some sense truly moral is a product of evolution in some sense. But that doesn't mean that everything that came along with that is good. And one thing that we can do is we can use our general capacity for reasoning to think our way beyond our tribal morality. So to give a sort of an example in another domain, we have these very big smart brains that allow us to devise technological solutions to our problems, right? Why do we have that? Well, in general, having this great brainy problem-solving capacity helps us survive and reproduce. Now, some smart human comes along and invents birth control, right? So here we are using our big brains to allow us to have sex without having children.
In some way defeating the purpose of evolution
right.
through
And what this examples, right, is that you can thwart nature's intentions with your big primate brain. That once you have the kind of intelligence that we have, we're no longer tethered to evolution's values. And so that's, I think, the story of modern morality, but it's an ongoing story.
And that's an interesting point I want to jump to in a minute, but I want to sort of, I think, hammer in a little bit this idea that of where these problems between tribes come from, because, working here at KPCC and anyone who reads the newspaper, we're constantly dealing with stories of tribes clashing over all sorts of things from, Republicans versus Democrats, Eastern values versus Western values, capitalism versus socialism. Do you like season 3 of Homeland versus you don't? All sorts of stuff that lead to bitter battles. And, I wonder a bit more, like, where does that come from that we feel this need to engage so vehemently in some of these topics?
Right.
I know one of the things you mentioned in your book, which kind of stood out to me, was that we have a tendency towards self-promotional bias a lot that we don't even realize we're doing. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think part of what you're getting at is that as a member of a tribe, and this is something you talked about when you talked about your experience in Japan, you didn't even realize you were in a tribe, that there were other ways of looking at the world until you stepped outside of it. It's like the fish who says, "What's water?" Right? The way our tribal moralities are expressed is through our gut reactions, through our common sense, through the way that we see the world. And so, aside from comparing ourselves to chimps who kill each other out on patrol, why do we fight about things like Obamacare or abortion? Well, our tribal values are encoded in our common sense, in our gut reactions. And when we encounter people with a different point of view, they just seem immoral or crazy or dishonest or both often. Because we can't believe that other people see things, could see things so differently. We have what psychologists call naive realism. That is the idea that we just see the world exactly as it is, and it's not any culturally specific values or vision that we're projecting onto the world.
Right. No, I totally agree with that because I'm usually right about stuff because I see it.
This doesn't apply to Sandin. He actually does see the world exactly as it is. But for the rest of us, right.
So I want my favorite question. Can you
Yeah.
tell us about some research that sort of how we learned some of this through research studies that have sort of shown that we have these sort of biases? Can you think of any studies that you?
Well, so I mean, this is not necessarily a heavily cultural version. But this is just an example of personal bias. And this is actually not an experiment, but it's supported by other research that's more controlled in the lab. So many years ago, U.S. News and World Report just did a readers poll. They asked people, suppose somebody sues you and you win. Should they pay your legal fees? And most people said yes.
Well, let's
They
do it.
asked
I want to see
different-
hands here. Okay, wait, let's think about this again.
Well,
If someone sues you, right?
Yeah.
And you win.
Right.
Should they pay your legal fees?
Right.
Everybody,
everyone-
what do you guys think? Should they? Yes? Hands
Right,
for yes?
okay.
Any hands for no?
Yeah. So they asked the question a different way, and now you guys
Okay.
are getting both, right? But you'd say, if you sue somebody and you lose, should you have to pay their legal fees?
All right, hands, yes.
Hands, right. And people say no, right? And this, what's interesting about this is it illustrates what I call biased fairness. So if I had just said to you, do you think that whether or not the winner or the loser pays the legal fees should depend on whether or not you're the one who won or lost? You'd say, no, that wouldn't be fair. It's
That's
not
not
like
fair,
one
yeah.
rule for me, another rule for other people. That would be blatantly unfair. But what we do is we go for the version of fairness that serves us best, right? So we say, okay, yeah, the loser pays. That seems reasonable. Or no, you still have to pay for your own legal fees, even if you win. Both of those could be reasonable
Yeah.
systems. But what we do is we go. So it's not complete blatant. I just want what's good for me. We want to be fair, but we like the version of fairness that serves us best.
It's like we're fine
right?
flipping a coin, but we
Right.
want to be the side that lands up.
Right. And so as a real world example of this, economists have done studies looking at negotiations over teacher salaries in different school districts, right?
Okay.
And the way this is done is they say, well, what should the salaries be in this school district? Well, they look at what's called comparable districts.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask the teachers union what's a comparable district, they point to the rich schools right over there, right? And if you ask the school superintendents what's a comparable district, they point to the poor community over there, right? So again, we all want to be fair. We all want to be fair, and we all want what's good for us, and we take the version of fairness that serves us best.
So what you're saying, and
Right.
this sort of plays out in this larger role where
Right.
we all want, sort of
Right.
fairness in our favor.
Right.
And that's how people start having, they don't
Right.
even realize they're
Right.
doing this, but they sort of
Right.
get into clashes, groups
Right.
get into other clash with
Right.
groups because they all sort of want things to come up for their side.
Right. And you see this at the group level as well. So this is a more lab phenomenon known as the hostile media effect. So this was work done in the 80s by Lee Ross and colleagues. They had people watch, so there's an event that's been called the Beirut Massacre. It's a terrible thing that happened in Beirut. You can imagine what it was like. And they had people from both sides, the Arab and the Israeli side, watch the same news footage of this event. And then they asked people, did you think that the news footage was biased in favor of your side or the other side, or was it perfectly fair? And both sides said that it was biased in favor of the other side, right? That anything that we don't like, we view it as biased, right? And in any telling of some story, unless it is really completely biased, there are going to be things that you don't like about it, right? And so we do this for ourselves, and we do this for our groups.
So why, I don't know if you can answer this, but why is that? I mean, it seems like this is such a base fundamental problem of humanity that we can't put ourselves in someone else's shoes so much of the time, and so many problems could be
Right.
solved. Do you have any thoughts on why we struggle with that so
So I
much?
mean, it really comes, if you believe as I do that, not that everything is biologically determined, but this is ultimately a biological phenomenon. From a biologist's point of view, the question is, why would we be any other way, right? And so the interesting question is, what are we doing right? What's enabling us to some extent to overcome these kinds of tribal tendencies?
It says sometimes be willing to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, or
Right.
help
Go to-
someone you don't have to help out, or share that money, the $10 to make it 40 or whatever.
Right, exactly.
Well, we're going to get into that in a little bit, but first, I don't know how many of you voted on the trolley problem. We had some stickers up in the lobby, and we talked about this.
Right.
Okay, so those of you who didn't, we're going to run through this real quick, because this will help us get a little bit into the some of the mechanisms of a morality.
Right.
Let's see if we got the next one. Okay, so we're going to be talking about trolleys here. And is this the first one, Elaine? Let's see. Pull, do nothing. Great. Perfect. So, okay, the trolley problem here we're going to look at. So basically, let's look at this diagram here. What's happening, do you want to help me talk through this here? There's a trolley careening out of control down a track. And then what's going on in front of it?
Well, so if you don't do anything, the trolley's going to run over and kill those 5 people. But you can save them. You can hit a switch that will turn the trolley onto that other track. But
you're the guy with the question mark above.
Right. It'll kill that one person. And so the question is it okay to hit the switch in order to minimize the number of deaths? And I know what most people around the world say.
But wait,
what does this audience say?
This is more participating. Okay, so here's what we had you say. You got little stickers here that represent your vote.
Right.
And it looks like a strong majority. You can see here, Josh.
There you go.
A strong majority says pull the switch, save the guy, or save the 5 guys, and doom the one poor fellow there who was already pretty lonely working on that side by himself and now has to die. Right. But that's 35, I think. 35 people voted for pulling. 11 said not pulling.
Right.
I think we have 3 conscientious objectors down there. So that's great, because that sort of backs up what most people do, right? Is that most people say, in this case, well, it's a tragedy either way, but it's better to save 5 lives if you can.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
All right, so we're going to take it a step further now to the trolley problem number 2. I wish I had Mr. Rogers' little ding, ding,
into moral Neverland, or whatever it is. Right?
Okay, this one's called the Footbridge case. What's going on here? We got a trolley careening down the track. Right. Which, really, when have trolleys ever been careening off track? But
I just was in San Francisco. Let me tell you, they got some crazy trolleys there. So the trolley's headed towards the 5 people, and now the only way that you can save them is to push that big guy off of the footbridge, and he'll land on the tracks, and he'll get squashed by the trolley.
Now, let's point out, the reason it has to be a bigger fellow than you is because you might think, well, I would sacrifice myself. In this case, we're assuming that you're too frail and weak, and you'd just be run over.
That's right.
You need someone. So it has to be someone else because you aren't physically big enough to stop.
And we stipulate that this will work. I understand you may have some concerns. Folks here from Caltech, is this... The JPL folks are saying this is harder than going to Mars. No, but we're assuming that this will work. Right. Yeah. So, do we poll, or do I just tell you what most people say?
Well, okay, so the decision here you have to make is, do you push this other poor person down to the ground, saving 5 workers who are laying down on the job?
Right.
But then dooming this one individual here who's doing nothing but admiring the workers. Or do you do nothing and have the 5 people be doomed? Do we have that?
I think we'll have to go with hands for that.
Oh, okay. Right? Okay, so we're going to go for hands for this. And so what do we say there? How many people would push the hapless person up there?
Okay, a couple of economists.
I'm gonna let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. A little over a dozen, maybe, people, which is pale in comparison to the 35 who would pull the switch. Right. And how does that fare with, when you do this in the lab?
Right. So we find in the lab, and people have done this on the web, people from all over the world, we've not found a place yet where people don't say, are not less comfortable with pushing the guy off the footbridge than hitting the switch. And in fact, if you typical samples in the United States, you'll get something like 20-30% of people saying that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge, whereas you'll get something more like 80-90% of people saying that it's okay to hit the switch. So we've got a little more balanced group here. And so the question is why? Now, philosophers have been arguing about this case for decades. What I and other people have done is tried to do the science of this and actually understand, psychologically speaking, what's going on.
Right, because let's break down here. I mean, the only real difference here is well, I guess that's the question, is what is the difference? But in each case, it's 1 life for 5.
Right.
And in each case, you have to take some action, and but the action's different. And so why is it people have such different reactions when ultimately, I guess, in the grand scheme of things, the end result is the same?
So I'll answer this on 2 different levels. So so my original research doing this with brain imaging and other studies since have shown is that it's really, and this is not going to become as a terrible surprise, that it's more of an emotional gut reaction in response to pushing the guy off the footbridge.
Right.
And some dramatic results, for example, from patients with lesions to a part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of the brain that was damaged in the famous case of Phineas Gage, if that's familiar.
Anyone raise a hand who've heard of Phineas Gage?
Phineas Gage fans? Oh, here you are.
I love this story. So
There
this
you
guy
go.
was a railroad worker, upstanding guy. Everyone loved him. And he was working on the railroad one day, and an explosion went off, and a big spike went through part of his head. And they thought, oh my gosh, Phineas is never going to survive. But they pull it out, and he actually does survive, but his prefrontal cortex is all mixed to mush. And he turns from this sort of upstanding gentleman into kind of a, sort of a Jekyll and Hyde thing. He's much more callous. He's swearing. He's blowing people off. He's like, I'm not going to go to your birthday party. I'll do whatever I feel like. And people think it's, what happened here? He changed so much. And we sort of started to realize that the prefrontal cortex, obviously, is this part of the brain that has a lot to do with, our planning, our emotions, our behaviors.
Yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing about it is that his character had changed, his personality and his moral judgment and his social judgment changed, but he could do math, he could speak. It wasn't, and this was one of the first major clues that there really are these separable circuits in the brain that do very different things, and that your ability to make judgments about, decisions about work or how you treat other people, that can be quite separate from what you might traditionally call your more cognitive faculties.
And just a note for any parents of teenagers out here, it's really important. I think all parents should be known that your prefrontal cortex in your teenage years is like going through some major construction. It's practically like Phineas Gage style damage. So if you have teenage kids and they're like acting like that character we just described, they're not bad people. They just have a little bit of reworking going on.
They might be
bad
people, but you can't make that judgment yet.
Right,
That's
right.
right. That's right.
But it's been proven that the prefrontal cortex in teenagers is basically damaged for a period of time until it finishes going through its rewiring. But anyway, so
back to trolleyology.
Yes.
If you look at these patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which you can think of as a kind of hub for emotional signals that bear on decision making, those people are about 2 times as likely, and it's more pronounced in other cases, to say that it's okay, twice as likely to push the guy off the footbridge. And the idea is that in healthy people, there's a kind of conflict within the brain. So you have a gut reaction that says, oh gosh, that just feels wrong. It's like smashing the guy's leg with a hammer. But at the same time, you go, but 5 lies for 1. That sounds reasonable. And those 2 thoughts sort of duke it out. But if you have your ventromedial prefrontal cortex destroyed, then you don't have that gut reaction that says, but you do have the cost-benefit analysis. And so you just go, 5 lies for 1. That sounds good. Another way of putting it is that if you have damage to this part of the brain, the switch case and the Footbridge case seem the same to you. Whereas if you're healthy, you have a gut reaction against it. So it's a kind of emotional response, and what the neurological studies tell us is that these are really distinct neural circuits that are producing these conflicting judgments.
And they both act at the same time? That we're
yeah,
both
these are operating in parallel and really sort of fighting it out. Now, that's answering it at one level. It's an emotional response. But what I haven't told you is actually what is it about the Footbridge case that's different?
Yeah.
And here we go more low tech. So we've done experiments where we ask people, so as I said, in the sample I'll describe, 30% of people say it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. If you describe it like this, you say, give it to a separate group of people, there's a guy on the footbridge, and you can hit this switch that will open a trap door and drop him onto the tracks. So you don't have to push him with your hands. You just drop him through the trap door. Now, about twice as many people say that it's okay.
Really?
And in fact, it's a majority. Yeah, about 60%
We like
in the
switches,
sample.
apparently.
Right. So it's something about pushing. And in fact, we've done a lot of versions. You do versions where you push the guy with a pole versus pushing with your hands. And
That's so
that's
impersonal.
about the same. Right. So it's not about touching, and it's not about distance. You can be pulling the switch from far away, pulling the switch right next to you, like, hey, Sandy, right? There you go. And that, it doesn't matter. It's the difference between the pushing and hitting with the switch. That's not the only factor that matters.
So what is it about the pushing then?
Well,
I mean, we could probably go down into a wormhole
It's
here,
an interesting question, but what the guy who did the experiment with the smash in the leg thinks is that this is something that we really learn early on in childhood, that the prototypical bad actions that you might perform as a 2-year-old, or that you might see someone else perform and watch either you get punished yourself or watch somebody else get punished or admonished for this, that pushing is a prototypically bad thing to do, whereas the act of hitting the switch, well, we hit switches for lots of things, right?
Right.
And so, the signal could get lost there. And how often do you have the opportunity to, if you're not Dr. Evil, to like harm somebody by hitting a switch, right? I know showing my age here.
Are
with
you just saying that like it's just the opportunity
right?
of being able to pull a switch and watch someone drop out of a trap door is enough?
It doesn't come along every day, right? It's not,
true.
quite sharks with lasers on their foreheads, but it's still pretty rare. So the idea is that, we have a capacity to feel bad about certain actions that we might perform. It's probably just not any random thing that's going to feel terrible, but that we learn through experience, our own experience, or seeing the experiences of others, to have a sense of right? And that's what's going on when you get the cold feet, when you simulate either in your mind or physically harming somebody.
So we really do have some sort of, whether it's moral or if it's just an evolutionary tendency, we really don't like actually doing the harming. I mean, it would partly explain why guns are a very popular way of violence rather than fist fights, or why...
Well, actually, what's interesting is guns are kind of in the middle. So we have enough, very few of us have, most of us have either not fired a gun or not fired a gun at a person, or been punished for firing a gun at a person, right? But nevertheless, we have enough vicarious experience through watching movies and with guns that if you do the same experiment with firing a gun, so the experiment with the smashing the leg, they did a version with a gun to someone's head, and you get the same kind of response.
Yeah, I tensed up just even thinking
Yeah,
about that.
there you go.
I don't think I could pull the trigger. Even if they told me it was blanks, I would say, but what if it wasn't? And
Right,
just wouldn't
right. So it can be vicarious learning, learning through observation as well.
So it's not just a sort of innate bred into us,
No, that's right.
It seems
It's
like
not hardwired.
We learn.
Right.
I mean, no one comes out of the womb and immediately knows what a gun is and how to use it.
Right.
That's cultural.
Right.
And mostly from Hollywood and video games and.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so that's very interesting. We talked a little about the trolley problem here, and one of the things you mentioned was you said we had these two competing kinds of morality, and I know you love this metaphor.
There you go.
In the book, you talk about it a lot. That it's almost like we have two different settings of a camera.
Right.
A manual setting and a kind of automatic setting. Explain that idea.
Yeah. So so the old camera here. And you've got your point and shoot settings. You can put it in landscape mode or portrait mode. And what's nice about those settings is that they're very efficient point and shoot, right? And they work pretty well most of the time.
And they're
you also
fast.
have fast, that's right. And you've got your manual mode where you can set the f-stop and everything else yourself.
Focus, zoom in and out.
And what's good, though, that's good for is when you need flexibility. You're doing some fancy artsy thing and you want it just so.
But that takes a little more time,
right? But it
too.
takes time. You have to know what you're doing. And so what's nice about having a camera that has both automatic settings and a manual mode is that it allows you to navigate this trade-off between flexibility and efficiency.
Okay, now tie it into morality.
Right, and so this is really the human brain has the same general design, and it's not just in the moral domain, but in general. Some of you may be familiar with Daniel Kahneman's book Thinking Fast and Slow, where he develops this idea not about morality, but about thinking in general. That is, we have gut reactions that are very efficient and that are informed by past experience, either the past experience of our ancestors coming through our genes, or cultural experience, or our own idiosyncratic experiences. And that gives us a sense of, what's good, what's bad, what should I do, what should I not do. And then our manual mode is our capacity for deliberate, explicit reasoning. So to take, the smashing the leg experiment, right, is, I say, well, I'll give you $10 to smash that person's, fake leg with a hammer. Your gut reaction says no because it feels like this horrible thing to do. Right. And that's probably reflecting a combination of biology and cultural experience and your own personal experience. But you could also say, no, in this situation, it looks like I'm harming somebody, but I'm really not harming anybody, and I'll get $10 if I do this, right? And so you can override that, right? And that's your manual mode, saying, yes, this feels like I shouldn't do it, but actually, given what I know about this particular situation and so on and so forth, it actually makes sense to go ahead and do it.
So in the trolley case, for instance, it's the automatic mode, the sort of fast gut reaction that says, pushing a guy feels really wrong. I don't want to do it. Right. But it's that sort of it's the automatic mode, right, that tells us not to do it. It's the manual mode, the long kind of, set it the process, really calculate things. It says, you know what, it's really the better decision to save 5 people if you can and sacrifice 1. Right. So it's those two different moralities that we see at play, and depending on kind of the strength of one or the other, one wins out, if you're actually pushing the guy versus pulling a lever.
Right.
I thought a lot about this metaphor. I likened it to another set of I thought of it more as the Dr. Spock and Kirk modes of morality, because
right.
Kirk is fast and he reacts from his gut, and he's down there making decisions and wooing ladies and whatever it takes to save the day. But Spock is very analytical and takes his time and does.
The
everything
ladies do
logical.
love Spock, though. But he's not working it the way Kirk
He doesn't
is.
love him the
I
same way
agree.
back.
Yeah,
He's
that's right.
very unless he rationally thought out a good excuse.
That's right.
But it's a fascinating idea you set up, in that you sort of say that we have these two different modes of morality in us. We have a Spock and a Kirk on our different shoulders telling us, oh, just do this, man. Or I guess Kirk would be more like, do this, right, man.
You
and
do
then
that
Spock
very
would be like,
well.
it's completely illogical. So. And then you say that, okay, so but if we want to solve some of these problems between tribes, when we're dealing with these giant moral issues that keep cropping up, maybe we need to rely a little less on the automatic settings, the Kirk side, and a little more on these manual mode, this, the Spock, the sort of longer thinking, the rational thought. And you propose that we do this by looking at type of philosophy called utilitarianism. I just want to see a show of hands. I'm loving the hands. And who here has studied utilitarianism? Anyone else?
Okay, we got a few.
Yeah, no, that's a good. I'd say that's like 25 people.
Yeah, this is a very nerdy crowd.
High fives.
That's right. Yeah.
So utilitarianism. Tell us a little bit about it. And we don't have forever. So and I know there's like tomes and tomes on this. If you had to summarize it in like maybe 5 tweets, how would you explain utilitarianism?
So 3 words: maximize happiness impartially. That's essentially the idea. Thank you. So this is the philosophy developed in the late 18th century and early mid 19th century by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and they were really very far ahead of their time when it comes to a lot of the major social issues of their day. So they were among the first opponents of slavery, among the first proponents of free speech and free markets. They were some of the first people to think seriously about animal rights, about the rights of prisoners, about women's rights, even gay rights in Jeremy Bentham's case. And he was not gay. It was just his own sort of thinking about this, which I can describe in a bit more detail. And they asked themselves, what is the essence of morality? And they sort of came down to really 2 things. One is essentially the golden rule, the idea that other people matter no more and no less than you do. Everybody's interests count the same.
The whole do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Now, this is a profoundly untribal way of looking at things. That is to say, and remember, the original formulation is don't do to your neighbor what you wouldn't have to do, but it's your neighbor, right? It's not everybody in the world. They're saying we should all treat each other like our neighbors, right? That's one. And then the other question is, well, what is the metric of well-being? This is the more controversial part of it. The idea is that ultimately everything that matters it cashes out in some sense in terms of the quality of people's experience. So one way to think about this is take anything you care about and sort of say, well, why do you care about that? And then you take that answer and say, well, why do you care about that? And why do you care about that? Until you run out of answers. So you say, why did you go to work today? Well, I enjoy my work, and well, why else? Well, I make money. Well, why do you want to make money? Well, I needed to pay the rent. Well, why do you want to pay the rent? And say, well, I need a place to sleep. Why can't you just sleep outside? Well, it's cold. Well, what's wrong with being cold? It's uncomfortable, right? Yeah. At the end, if you follow those chains, it's always going to be about your experience or somebody else's experience. That's the idea. Controversial, but plausible.
Right, and specifically about happiness, that you do various things, it boils down to you do it because in some way it'll work out to you being more happy than you would be if you didn't.
Right, and it's not that there aren't many things that we value. So we might value honesty, and we might say honesty is its own reward, we value it in and of itself. But the thought is that, well, why do we really care about honesty? Why does being dishonest feel like smashing somebody's leg in a sense? And it's because, well, bad things happen when people are dishonest, right? If honesty never led to good things and dishonesty never led to bad things, we probably wouldn't have that feeling that honesty is inherently good and that dishonesty is inherently bad.
Right.
And so their analysis is that, of course, there are all these things that we value or maybe even think that we value in and of themselves, but if you really look at them, trace those chains of value all the way back, it ultimately comes down to the quality of somebody's experience. And they said, well, look, if the essence of morality is everyone gets the same consideration, and what ultimately matters, the sort of value behind all our other values, it's like the Higgs boson of normativity. It's the value behind the other values.
Absolute common denominator.
Right? That common currency is our well-being, which you could call happiness. It's a little misleading because when you talk about happiness, what you think of are things like raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, the things that make you smile, but it's really the quality of your experience, right? So, changing your brake pads is not one of the things I think of as making me happy. But if I didn't change the brake pads on my car, I could be
unhappy.
a lot less happy, right?
Yeah.
So it's everything. And they said and what was really important about this is that it gives you a common currency, that no matter what tribe you belong to, you don't want to suffer. You want to be happy, and you want the people you care about to be happy and to not suffer. And so we can argue endlessly about what's inherently right and what's inherently wrong, what rights people have, what duties people have, what this God says versus what that God said. But they said, look, there's something real here on the ground that we can use as our common currency for deciding when the values of different groups clash.
Yeah.
How do you make that trade-off? And that was their answer.
So, and one thing I really liked, I studied utilitarianism in college, and one thing I liked about it is they almost in a mathematical way tried to look at, can we add up the different, if you got two sides of a question here, should we get pizza for dinner, and you had a group of people who love pizza, group of people who don't like pizza, and there's a lot more people who love pizza. It's sort of, overall a better decision to go with the pizza. I mean, that's not a moral decision. But it sort of showcases you could sort of they have almost a mathematical approach that whatever decision in the aggregate makes for the most sort of happiness or the most well-being is the best decision to make here.
So this, they're really true. And there's another side to this though, that a caricature of this view is that you go through your whole life with a clipboard adding up costs and benefits. Oh, I'm in the store. Should I steal that thing? They say, well, let's consider the costs and consider the benefits.
Yeah, this is totally ridiculous because in real life we'd have an app on our phones.
Right,
Clipboards.
that's right. The morality app, exactly. We got an app for that. So what they say, and what this is often ignored, is that when it comes to the basic morality of everyday life, you should just trust your gut reactions, right? When it's the basic us versus them problem of should I be selfish or should I care about other people, that's what our gut reactions are pretty good for. And not only that, your manual mode is pretty good at rationalizing things, at saying, oh, yeah, if I lose, then I shouldn't have to pay the legal fees, right?
Right.
That's fair, right? And so they got this, and they said, look, for most of ordinary life, you should just try to be a good person in the conventional sense. If you go off trying to calculate, you're more likely to calculate in your own self-interest than to calculate for the greater good. But where their ideas are really valuable is not when it's about selfishness versus concern for others, but when it's about different conception of what's right or what's wrong, when it's us versus them, our interests versus their interests, our values versus their values, the right to life versus the right to choose, Israelis versus Palestinians. That's where their perspective, I think, is really valuable, because we have those gut reactions, but our gut reactions can't both be right.
And they're not getting us anywhere.
And they're not getting us anywhere. And so their idea is to say, look, when you're dealing with the complex problems of the modern world, the problems that divide people, not just me versus you, but this group versus that group, that's where taking a step back from our gut reactions and saying, well, what's likely to produce good results, and what evidence do we have one way or another? That's where that, I think, can be really useful.
And so I'm just going to quick plug for the book here, Moral Tribes. We have it for sale outside. In it, Josh here goes through a lot of the sort of criticisms of utilitarianism, some of which are really fascinating, bizarre thought games you can play. Yeah. And he also defends against them. He does a really good job sort of laying out both of them. And he talks a lot more about how to apply utilitarianism. He gives it a better name, deep pragmatism. Yeah. Which he's trying to rebrand. We were talking maybe. Right. I was thinking maybe we should go with something a little shorter. What were the hashtags we came up with?
Deep prag,
prag swag.
Right. Yeah.
Feel free to tweet those out after you read the book and you want to make some moral claims about what's right and wrong. Hashtag prag swag.
Right.
But we're going to leave that for you to go into the book if you want to find out more about that, because it could take some time. But it's fascinating to look at, and especially if you're a philosophy nerd, I recommend it. But we're going to go to questions from the audience here in just a second. So gather your thoughts now. You've had some time to digest some of this. And if you want to hit him with hard moral questions, feel free. Yeah. If you want to ask more about the brain science, one of the great things about having Dr. Greene here is that he can do both psychology and science, and he can combine the two. So feel free to go in either direction. But before we ask our audience to join in, I just want to ask you one more question, which is, so you have this philosophy. You think we can try to solve some moral quandaries using this utilitarianistic approach, this deep pragmatism.
Deep pragmatist, yes.
Instead of just sort of our gut reactions. So let's apply that a little bit right now. I think one of the things that a lot of people are struggling with right now, we have this disaster happening in the Philippines, right? And I think it affects all of us on an emotional level.
Yeah.
But there's also the sense that it's very far away. I've thought about sometimes whether I should give, but then I also think, well, if I'm going to give, why don't I give money to people in my neighborhood? If I'm going to give $10, there's a lot of people who need it, and there's a lot of money going there. How do you sort of apply your thinking towards a situation like this?
Yeah, so my thinking about this begins with a famous thought experiment from philosopher Peter Singer, who about 40 years ago posed the following dilemma. He said, suppose you're walking by a pond and there's a child who's drowning in this pond, and you could wade in and save this child easily, but you're wearing your fancy new suit, and if you do this, you're going to ruin your fancy suit, and cost you, I don't spend a lot on clothes, but let's say it's $500, $1,000. I don't know. We tell my well-dressed colleagues, tell me, Josh, it costs more than that. But whatever it is, your nice suit. How many of you think it would be morally monstrous if you let the child drown because you're worried about your suit? So I see lots of hands.
That's
going
like
up.
every hand in the room.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So now,
you guys clearly
different
no slave
case.
fashions here.
Right. So there are people on the other side of the world, children on the other side of the world, who are desperately in need of food and medicine. And by making a donation about the price of a nice new suit, you could save one of these children's lives. Maybe more than one. Maybe only have a 50-50 chance. How many of you think that you're a moral monster if you spend money on things like suits that are nice to have but you don't really need when you could use it to save someone's life, right?
Monster.
So, monster, right.
So that was about 5.
And how many of you actually live that, right?
There's one
Couple.
guy.
One guy. All right, good.
Or a girl, I can't tell.
Yeah. So,
Kudos to you, person.
So big difference between those cases. So Peter Singer's challenge was, what is really the difference between those two cases? And very smart philosophers came along and said, I can tell you what the difference is. Well, here, when the child's drowning right in front of you, then you're the only one who can save that person. But when it's across the ocean, there are lots of people who could save those people. So you have a special obligation here, not there. And then Peter Singer says, well, suppose there are a lot of people standing around this pond wearing their nice suits, and none of them are doing anything. Now is it okay for you to let the child drown? And you go, well, okay, maybe not, right? And you can just go on and on and on. I, with Jay Musin, a student of mine, we wanted to say, well, let's see if we can do this as a real scientific experiment. So we did a version of this. It's a little different. And
you didn't drown any kids.
We didn't. No, this is an interview about the IRB. The review board would not let me drown any people or run anybody over with trolleys. Unfortunately, I've tried. So in our version, we asked people. Suppose that you are vacationing in this lovely but poor country. You have your little cottage up in the mountains overlooking the coast, and a terrible typhoon hits, and the coast is devastated, and people there's sanitation problems. People need medicine. They need clean water. They need food. The best thing you can do is not to go down there and try to help yourself, but to just make a donation to the Red Cross or Oxfam or one of the other organizations that's on the ground helping.
Sure.
And we asked people, do you have an obligation to give some money?
A moral obligation?
I don't remember the exact wording, but that was certainly the implication,
right.
if not explicitly stated. And in this sample, 68% of people said that you have an obligation to do something. We asked a randomly chosen different group of people this version of the question. Suppose that your friend is over there and you're at home at your computer. Your friend has a smartphone and is showing you everything that's going on. So you see everything your friend sees, you hear everything your friend hears, and you can help just as much as your friend by making a donation online, but you're thousands of miles away. Do you have an obligation to make a donation to help those people? And now about half as many people, 34% in our sample, said that you have an obligation to help. And what's nice about this is that it makes Singer's original thought experiment a more controlled actual experiment.
Right.
Where it seems like what really is making the difference here is just mere physical distance. Now, you might, like those philosophers back in the day, say, oh, well, there must be some really good reason why. Well, maybe, or maybe not. Now, why would distance seem to matter? Well, this brings us back to our sort of tribal biology. We evolved to cooperate in small groups, and if someone is drowning right in front of you, then that's a member of your tribe, and that's going to come. You're going to be rewarded, or it's going to come back to haunt you if you don't. That they're part of your community, and so it makes sense that we have heartstrings that can be tugged, but it also makes sense that those heartstrings don't wrap around the world, right? That our feelings are not, our social feelings, our empathy is not as easily engaged by people who are on the other side of the world.
But if we were to take your pragmatic approach,
Right. So this is bringing it back to that. So what Peter Singer, who is a deep pragmatist, a utilitarian, said is, it may feel like there's an important moral difference here, and we see this in the psychology in the lab, and it makes biological sense that we evolved to care about the person who's drowning in front of you, but not the person on the other side of the world who's a member of another tribe. But does that really make sense? And this is like kicking the ladder away after you've climbed it. This is like your brain inventing birth control, even though it's not what evolution wants, right? That is, our morality can now be more than what it evolved to be. We can use our capacity for reason. We can do scientific experiments to understand ourselves. We can look at what those scientific experiments reveal and say, is that really what matters? Should I save this person's life? Well, how many feet away, right? Through this combination of a basic feeling of empathy, I care about this person in front of me, and reasoning, and why should I care any less about that person on the other side of the world?
Right.
We can make progress. So that's really what the book's about.
The difficult thing about that is it kind of reminds you that it's a lot harder to be a really good person than you might want to believe sometimes.
Yeah, but so I think that the trick is to not try to be perfect, but for us to recognize and understand and acknowledge our limitations and do the best we can. So, one of the criticisms of deep pragmatism is, in principle, you should turn yourself into a happiness pump, right?
Right.
That is, there are always people suffering in the world,
Always
and your whole
someone-
life should just be about producing resources for them. Well, that's not the life that we evolved to live, right? And the way I think of it is, it's kind of like dieting. If you're dieting or trying to eat a healthy diet, you might say, well, I should eat exactly this amount of protein and exactly this amount of fat and exactly these intervals and do exactly this exercise. And if you're a computer, you could do that. But you're a person, and the optimal strategy is not to try to be physiologically optimal. The optimal strategy is to set reasonable goals and try to achieve those reasonable goals, taking into account your own weaknesses and limitations as a real person. And I think the same thing goes doubly for trying to be a good moral person. You're not going to turn yourself into a human happiness pump, even if that would in some sense be ideal. But that doesn't mean you're completely off the hook. So, buy nice things for yourself and for your friends, but save a little extra money. Give 2% of your income to charity. If the affluent world gave 2% of its income to help the people in the world who are less fortunate, the world would be a dramatically different place, and most of us wouldn't even feel the difference.
Some good thoughts there. So we're going to go to questions now. Jeremy Bentham, this is his body
Oh,
stuffed
yeah.
and preserved. I was going to talk about
I
that.
was there at University
seen it
College
too.
London.
Jeremy Bentham's a fascinating guy. Read up on him, and you can
Yeah.
find out why he did this.
They have his brain in
let's
a
see.
jar.
Deep pragmatism
Yep.
and questions. Here we
Yep.
go. So we've got two people with microphones roaming the audience, and if you have questions, just raise your hand. They'll get to you. And we'll go right over here first. Haley's got the mic.
So I was channel surfing about a month ago and came across Turner Classic Movies. And there's a film called Stranded with Tyrone Power. I don't know if you've seen it,
No.
but it essentially tells a true story of a liner that goes down in the ocean.
Yeah.
And there are 26 people surviving with a 12-man lifeboat.
Yeah.
And he has to decide who's going to survive
Yeah.
for the next 30 days
Yeah.
in hopes that they can get to land.
Yep.
What do you do? I mean, it was amazing to watch them play out the thought processes
Yeah.
of who to toss overboard
Yeah.
and to decide essentially who's going to hopefully survive from this.
So we actually, in the original brain imaging experiments with these trolley cases, we actually used a case like that, the Lifeboat case, where do you throw somebody over if they don't have a good chance of surviving anyway, and you could keep the boat afloat. No, I think it's the same tension. That is, you can recognize that it's for the greater good to keep the boat afloat, to keep the people who are going to, at least allow some people to survive. But the idea of tossing somebody over feels pretty awful, and it's good that we feel that way. But maybe in some situations, it's better that we put that feeling aside. Otherwise, everyone's going to die. So I think your instincts are exactly right. That case captures the same tension.
We'll go with the next question right over here.
Can I stand? Can I hold it? Okay.
The microphones are very sensitive. That's why we tend to hold them in the right
it's
way.
radio. I forgot. My question is about the solution, deep pragmatism,
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
So you decided that reason is the solution, but I'm wondering why you chose that over empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could see utilitarianism as, weighing and measuring, or you could also see it as expanding the definition of what the tribe is.
Right.
So I was maybe you could address that.
Right. So I think that utilitarianism is not just about reason. It's essentially, I actually describe it this way in the book, is empathy is the seed, and then it's watered with reason. That is to say, so raw empathy is very fickle, right? I care about you if you're here, but not if you're over there. I care about you if I'm pushing you, but not if I'm harming you by hitting a switch. I care about you if you're a member of my tribe, but not if you're my friend, if you're my cousin, whatever, right? And the problem is, empathy is not going to tell us how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, especially because both sides empathize much more with their own than they do with people on the other side, right? So on the one hand, there has to be some basic emotional seed that says, look, other people count, right? But if we're going to resolve disagreements, it can't just be based on empathy, because people's empathy is different. People empathize more with some people rather than others. And so instead, that basic idea of other people count, I care about other people, has to be made into something that can be coherent and consistent, like, okay, I care about other people and everybody's interests count the same. And, other species may well be capable of feeling empathy for each other, but only a human who's capable of reasoning can say, all right, we're going to give everybody exactly the same weight. That is, you said, a kind of mathematicalization of empathy. And if the question is, how are we going to resolve disagreements where people have different feelings, we can't rely on the feelings. And that's why I think that in daily life, empathy is what enables us to get along with individuals in the context of personal relationships. But when it comes to my group versus your group, that's when I think we have to step back, because our feelings are what have us in trouble in the first place.
One of the nice things about this book is that he lays out his arguments, but if you want to write a book refuting them, I think there's plenty of chance to do that too. Lots of other ideas. So if any of you've got your own thoughts on morality,
right.
I'm sure he would welcome the discussion.
Bring
and
it
challenge.
on. Come on. Yeah.
Okay, we got lots more questions. So we'll go. Haley, your call.
Hi, I was wondering if you're aware of any mathematical models of the propagation of altruistic traits, either genetic or cultural, and if so, are they useful?
So I guess
Can you explain what he's asking?
so it depends on what you mean by mathematical models. But so I described the experiment where we put people under time pressure. They became more cooperative, or that experiment. One of my collaborators on that experiment is someone named Martin Novak, who is sort of the king of mathematical models of cooperation. And he's done a lot of different sort of computer simulations trying to figure out what does it take for cooperation to evolve. So you just have these computer representations of these different agents that can either be cooperative or be uncooperative, and they play against each other.
So this is basically trying to come up with a mathematical formula to predict when people would cooperate.
Yeah. The question is, what are the conditions under which cooperation can arise?
Oh, okay.
Right?
Interesting. Okay.
And so, for example, if you have one of the findings is if you just have a population where people can cooperate or defect, the defectors tend to win. That is because if you have a group that just cooperates, well, then the exploiters are going to do very well. However, if you have it played out on a spatial grid, where basically you can form neighborhoods where people are more likely to interact with certain individuals who are around them, then cooperation is much more likely to evolve. So the fact that we evolved on the surface of a sphere, let's say, instead of in just some kind of mush where you're as equally likely to interact with anyone in the population, that by itself can make a difference. So that's an example of sort of mathematical modeling of these things. What the mathematical models generally don't do is get inside the black box of the mind. They just sort of treat the agents in these simulations as just strategies without any sort of understanding of the motivations or of different processes within the agents that compete with each other. And so what we kind of came together on this experiment is the idea is he does the models of thinking of these things as just abstract strategies. I think about things in terms of the camera, the dual process psychology, gut reactions versus thinking. And is really led by this former postdoc, now a professor at Yale, David Rand, who really brought us together on this. So I shouldn't take too much credit. But if you go to Martin Novak's webpage or David Rand's webpage, you can see a lot of work on sort of abstract mathematical models of cooperation, which I think is really, as I said, the core of morality.
That's fascinating. Teaching computers to cooperate, though, is not a good idea. I've seen Terminator.
You've seen
2.
HAL on 2000. That's right.
I got more questions.
Right.
Elaine, back in the back.
So, two questions, one serious, one sort of silly. But in your book, I take a lot of it as academic, and at the end, do you sort of make personal proposals, like give 10%, and these are the foundations I recommend giving to?
Yeah, so I didn't specify any numbers, but I do in the last chapter try to bring it back down to earth with a few sort of guidelines. And a lot of them are things in a way that we've already covered. That is, so one of the major ideas is, when it comes to me versus us, when you're dealing with sort of the morality of everyday life, should I be selfish or should I do what's good for other people? Or that's when you want to trust your moral instincts. When it comes to moral controversies, we have whole groups who disagree. That's when our moral instincts are likely to get us in trouble. I think something we didn't talk about is the way that we can use rights as a kind of rationalization, that whenever we feel something in our hearts is right or wrong, we can make that sound very objective and rational by saying, I feel that abortion is wrong, so I'm going to say that a fetus has a right to life, or I feel that abortion is okay and it's wrong to restrict someone's freedom to choose, say, I believe we have a right to choose. Well, maybe we do, maybe we don't, but it's actually pretty hard to provide a coherent, I think, justification on either side.
Rights are sort of like a conversation stopper.
Yeah, the rights kind of get used as a way of sort of putting your foot down. And my view, and I developed this much more in the book, is that if you're just fighting a war of words, then fine, rights are great weapons to use. But if you really are trying to convince somebody that making claims about rights without any reference to consequences, without any reference for what actually happens if we do this versus we do that, it sounds like a rational enterprise, but it's really an exercise in rationalization. That's another example. And then I do talk about at the very end about the value of giving, that if you're an affluent person and you can make a modest sacrifice in order to make an enormous impact on someone else's life, then that's really worth doing. And how far you want to go, that's a difficult question. But at least, if you do a little bit more than you otherwise would be inclined to do, that by itself can make a big difference without hurting you very much.
We got more questions. Haley, find someone.
You stand up. I have a lot of friends that work in the medical field and are scientists, and not very many of them are philosophers. So I'm wondering if the science led you to the utilitarianism or the other way around.
Good question.
So it's kind of a bit of both. I mean, I didn't start doing my own experiments until after I had sort of started to form some of my philosophical views. But I would say that my philosophical views were informed by my understanding of the relevant science, even if it wasn't science that I did myself. So I would say it's kind of been a back and forth dialogue in my case between thinking about these things as a philosopher and thinking about these things from a scientific perspective, if not as a working scientist myself.
Elaine, you have someone you want to call? Let's go someone up front here, yeah.
So So the idea of having this the distance sort of decrease with, or as distance increases, empathy decreases, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that translates to time? And so that there's a temporal aspect where we tend to, I thought of this recently when, I don't know if you saw this going around the internet, but these old black and white photos that were changed to color.
Mm-hmm.
And you see some of them where there are people in really rough situations, and it was weird for me to see once it was in color, I immediately empathized more because it seemed more real.
Yeah.
And also looking forward, we don't tend to try to prevent societal injury. We just try to put on a Band-Aid once it's already happened. So have you thought about whether that translates or if that's just a whole different complicated thing?
So the question is, can we fail to empathize with not just people who are far away in space, but far away in time, so future generations, or even people in the past? Is that I think that's right. That far away in time or far away in space they're both a similar. It seems to be a similar kind of metric of psychological distance. And there's actually some experimental research to suggest that we associate. We use the metaphor, right? We say far away in time. What we're really using is a spatial metaphor to talk about time. These things are really intertwined in our mind. And this is part of one of the problems, for example, with environmental regulation or thinking about global warming, right? I mean, if we were dealing with this now, or if this was going to happen tomorrow, our attitude about it would be very different than if it's at some distant point in the future. And people on the pro-life side of the abortion debate might say, look, you're not taking seriously the life of that hypothetical person who could exist. Now, the problem with that is that you could say, well, if you're talking about hypothetical lives that could exist, you should also perhaps be opposed to abstinence or birth control. So, the argument can cut many different ways. But I think you're absolutely right that the temporal dimension has the same kind of distancing power as spatial distance.
All right, we have 2 more questions. We're going to take one from this side first.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering if that question about the spatial and temporal distance, if it's similar to something that's a not moral question at all, but how we make decisions relatively. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we'll drive all the way across town to save 3 cents on gas.
Right.
But when we bought that car,
right.
3 cents isn't going to make a difference.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this is like an example that you of sort of thinking fast and slow, right? That it's a framing effect. That when you're deciding, for example, right, whether if you could buy some microwave or something like that and save $20 on it, you'd say, all right, well, I'll drive a little farther for that. But if you're buying a $5,000 car or $20,000 car, you're not going to care at all about $20 or $30, and it's because the larger financial frame makes it seem relatively insignificant. And you do see things like this in the moral domain. So one thing we found and other people have found is that as the number of lives that you can save increases, each individual life seems to get less psychological weight. So you can save 1 life, and you say, oh, that seems really important, 2 lives. By the time you get to 100 lives, 105 lives, it all just sounds the same. It's just a lot or a fair amount, right? Why would this be? To make a long story short, one of the experiments I've done with student Amitai Shenhav, we had people make decisions about saving people involving different numbers of lives and different probabilities of saving them. And what this experiment revealed in the most general terms is that we use the same basic valuation mechanisms to attach a value to saving 50 lives with a 20% probability or saving 30 lives with a 50% probability or something like that. And we do when we're making gambles about money or about food, and it's the same circuits that you see in other mammals, in monkeys or even in rats. And thinking about this as a basic mammalian valuation device, most of the things, for example, that rats, or everything that rats value, which is basically things like food, the value of those things levels off. So if you're a rat, you don't have a fridge. There's only so much, food that you can eat, and it loses its value very quickly as the quantity goes up, right? And that's true for most goods that you could consume yourself. You ask people about saving people's lives, well, there's no reason, if you ask me and Peter Singer, why you should care about the 105th life that you can save any more than the first or the second life. But if we're essentially, to put it crudely, using our rat brains to place values on these things, right, then it gets framed in that way in terms of the quantity, right? And so it's a similar kind of thing that, when you're thinking about saving 10,000 lives versus 8,000 lives, it's like, oh, what's a couple thousand lives, right? What's a couple of extra dollars when you're buying a car, right? And so these sorts of biases are kind of built into our valuation mechanisms because we inherited them from our ancestors, human and otherwise, that were making very different kinds of decisions. They weren't buying cars and driving across town, and they certainly weren't saving the lives of people on the other side of the world. And so part of why I think, again, this more mathematized sort of refinement of our empathy is so important is because it allows us to transcend the limitations of the biological machinery that we were given to make everyday choices.
It's like that famous quote that a single death is a tragedy,
right,
but 1,000 deaths is a statistic.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, we have one more question. Elaine in the back, you have it there.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you what you think about the focus on third world countries. I feel like Save Darfur is an example.
Right.
We put a lot of energy into that, but then we have homeless people and poor people in our own country
right,
that we walk over every day.
Right. So I think part of the reason why a lot of people in the sort of international community and nonprofit world are focused on saving people that, from the United States perspective, are overseas, is just where do you get the most bang for your buck, right? That if resources are relatively expensive here in the United States, so $100 that you'd spend on people in the United States, just in terms of improving the human condition, goes less far than it does in a country where that money is worth so much more. So that's one reason why there tends, among policy wonks, to be a focus on international aid.
Which kind of actually seems like a more utilitarianistic view.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's what kind of makes the wonks wonky. But many people feel like, well, we should be helping people here at home before we're worried about people who overseas. And I feel the pull of that as well, that there's something about we need to strengthen our own society so that we can then sort of build outward. At the same time, though, I mean, if you ask me if I could save, this is sort of making up stylized numbers, but if I could save the life of, one American person who's in a desperate situation, or 4 people in Africa, let's say, I'd rather go with the numbers, but that's my deep pragmatist perspective. But it conflicts, I think, with some of our gut reactions about here versus there.
Well, I think one of the simplest takeaways of all this is that it's not easy to make these moral decisions.
Yeah.
It's not easy both to go with your gut sometimes and the consequences, and it's not easy to think it out. But hopefully, thinking about it and learning about how we react and why makes us all better people, and we'll make better decisions. And ultimately, hopefully, we'll create a better world out of it.
That's the hope.
Anyway,
Thanks.
well, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone give a big round of applause. Josh Greene will be outside. We've got books for sale. You can get them signed. And, if you want to ask him your own personal moral quandary, I'm sure he'll be willing to weigh in.
The
So thank you,
doctor is
everybody. Thank you for joining us. And please come to more events. We have them all the time. And we love seeing smart, capable, attractive audiences like you there. So hope to see you in the future.